Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah wa barakatuh. Inshallah, we're going to continue with our discussion of this book, The Anarchy by William Dalrymple, The Relentless Rise of the East India Company. So this is the second video. And in this video, I want to go into, or dive rather, right into the first chapter, chapter number 1, which is just titled with the date 1599. So the author, Dalrymple, talks about an event on the 24th of September in 1599, which took place in London. And the main character in this incident is someone called Sir Thomas Roe. And he basically had a meeting with a number of people to set up a company which would be funded by people buying shares effectively in that company to start its voyage, start exploring the new world and also other opportunities to acquire money. And what they wanted to do also is to petition the rather old aged Queen Elizabeth I, to start up a company. So people would buy individual subscriptions, they would pay money into this company, and the company would then go out with that money on ships to on voyages and come back with wealth, and then people would get their returns in relation to how much they had invested in the company. So this was the East India Company beginning to emerge. Okay. Now, I mentioned in last lecture, it was a small company. Now when we look back, we see it as a big company. I mean, it grew to control almost half of the world's trade. Eventually, half the world's trade was controlled by the East India Company, and it became one of the most powerful corporations in human history. Okay, Edmund Burke famously once said, "A state in the guise of a merchant." It was so big, it was almost like another country of its own as well. But that's not how it looked when it first began in 1599. When the company first began in 1599, it wasn't a big company like we mentioned in the previous lecture as well. It's also worth mentioning that England as a country was struggling to compete with other European powers. So there was a scramble, if you like, from many European countries, especially France, Spain, Holland, or the Netherlands, who were really going around the world and acquiring huge amounts of wealth from various countries outside of Europe as well. So they wanted a state sanction to go out. They wanted state support to go out and conduct their business as well. So really, the British were amateurs. The English were amateurs when it came to other European powers. This is how it was in 1599. And so there were a number of voyages that went out. Some were successful, some were less successful in their attempts to come back with wealth from various places. However, the Portuguese and the Spanish were much more sophisticated, and they were busy for over a century, basically plunging the New World. Right, New World is what's now America, and this history is really, really important. We're not going to go into that history of the New World, especially with the Black Lives Matter movement and slavery and so forth. In fact, the New World and its goal made Spain into one of the most richest countries in Europe. It's worth bearing that in mind. And Portugal had control of the seas and the spices of the East, and it was very close in competition with Spain. So Spain and Portugal were world leaders at that point in history. And Holland was also very, very successful as well. The Dutch were very, very successful in acquiring lots of various types of wealth items in really bolstering their nation and acquiring lots of wealth as well. So those are things worth bearing in mind. So the British were really, really struggling, but they had a desire to catch up. They wanted to catch up with these European powers who were far, far ahead of them at that moment in time. And the story basically goes, in a nutshell, is they ended up in India. The Mughal Empire was basically fighting amongst itself eventually, and that gave them an opportunity. What really gave them the opportunity was an invasion from Iran, from Persia, which really really opened the gates. There was an invasion, which we'll go through in this lecture, in Delhi, which was ransacked. Basically, it's like a lion coming in to India and just taking and pouncing upon everything and just leaving. Right? They didn't stay there. They didn't remain in India. They took what they needed to take and left all the wealth, and that left India very vulnerable. The French were already there. The French were competing with the British. As you know, in history, we're always competitors with the British, with the French. Eventually, a number of things happened which gave the British the upper hand over the French, and then they gradually made their way and conquered India. Okay, so going back to the company again, the East India Company, it was a joint stock corporation, so it was open to all investors. Anybody could invest into the company, put money in, and they'd go out and, with your money, go on adventures, go on exploration, and whatever wealth they came back with, you would get a share of that as well. This was really an innovation of Tudor England. It was a brilliant revolutionary innovation. They had this idea. I mean, we have it for granted nowadays, but this was an innovation that emerged at the time as well. And so people were investing in this new type of business venture as well. However, while they were preparing to gain money and investment to sort of explore these new countries, the New World, India, all these other places, the British or the English had struck a peace agreement with the Spanish, who were their rivals. So you'll read in Ottoman history as well how the Ottoman Sultan sent a number of ships to defend Britain, because obviously there was religious wars between the Protestants and the Catholics at the time as well, which we won't go into. So peace negotiations really brought this company to a standstill because they couldn't really go out and compete because they had peace. However, this peace talks between the British, or between the English and the Spanish, broke down, and so they were given free rein to run the seas, to go into the seas and plunder, to loot whatever they wanted, to explore whatever they wanted to go as well. So on the 31st of December 1600, the date is very, very interesting, the last day of the first year of the new century, the governor and company of merchants of London trading to the East Indies, a group of 218 men, received their royal charter. They got the stamp of approval to do what they wanted to do as well. It took 2.5 centuries for this company to really become the monster that it became later on. But the charter allowed the company imperial power. It became a very powerful company, if you like, a very, very powerful army, which eventually came to control millions of people as well. They began to build ships. They appointed people to manage those ships. One of them was someone called Sir James Lancaster. His ship, when it was finally built, they had ships that were refitted. They basically made them custom made for their voyages to India. In 1602, in June, the fleet that Sir James Lancaster was leading made its way to a place called Aceh, and they began to negotiate with the Sultan there for spices. And he returned back, and he came back with a lot of wealth. So this immediately excited people, right? But the wealth they were bringing back, or the amount of money, or the amount of spices and whatever else they were bringing back, for example, they brought 900 tons of pepper, cinnamon, cloves. These were things that are not available in England, of course, and lots of other things as well. It was really insignificant compared to what the, for example, what the Dutch and the French and the Spanish were bringing back from their conquest. So this was really, really a competitive climate, even in the 1600s. Okay, and so the company, East India Company, was really a modest company when it first started. It was nothing like it was later to become later on in the world later on as well. So they were still very, very small fish, if you like, as well, and they were minor players in many ways as well. They tried and tried again. They had some difficult circumstances. Eventually, their luck came when they started to tap into the Indian market. Okay, and in 1608, and you have to give it to the English, the English for their dedication. On the 28th of August in 1608, Captain William Hawkins, he anchored his ship, which was called the Hector, off Surat. Surat is actually where my parents are actually from as well, or my grandparents are even from. And he became the first commander of the company to set foot on Indian soil. So Captain William Hawkins. And you have to remember that India had a population of around 150 million people, about a fifth of the total of the world. And it was producing, this is really interesting, a quarter of global manufacturing, right? This is how powerful India was before the East India Company even set foot on it. And it was a world's industrial powerhouse and the world's leader in manufactured textiles. Very, very interesting. Later on, we'll talk about manufacturing, because the town that I live in is also embroiled, and the towns that are the areas around where I live around in England are very much embroiled in manufacturing, and to do with the East India Company, even the history of the Raj as well. But we'll talk about that at some other point. If you want to compare what India was to what England was at the time, England only had a 5% population of India compared to India's population. So England had 5% of the population India had, and it was only producing 3% of the world's manufactured goods, right? So you're looking at a quarter of the world's manufactured goods compared to 3% of the manufactured goods that are produced in the world. So it's really, really powerful empire. The Mughal Empire was a real machine in its heyday. The Mughal Emperor had an income of 100 million, and he was by far the richest monarch in the world. Okay, the cities were mega cities. If you read the history of these cities, they were really, really lush, powerful, vibrant places as well. And a lot of wealth was coming into these places. At the same time, this is worth knowing, elsewhere in the world, the European powers were very much engaged in conquest. So the Aztec Empire, for example, in 1520, the Spanish had swept away the vast Aztec Empire, which is now basically a relic of history. So this whole part of the world was being cleared out. So the Aztec Empire, the mighty Aztec Empire, was now completely wiped out in a matter of months. The Dutch were doing their stuff in the islands of Moluccas, for example. And they initially were, a lot of these places, by the way, they started trading with them. So the way in was they would trade with the natives, but eventually they would slaughter them. So, for example, he gives an example that the Dutch had recently begun to run their cannons on the same rulers they had earlier traded with, slaughtering those islands who rode out in canoes to greet them, burning down their cities and seizing their ports. So this narrative that we have, Europeans were very benevolent to these people. It's very easy to challenge this. On one island alone, he notes, Lonto, the island's called, 800 inhabitants were enslaved and forcibly deported to work on new Dutch spice plantation in Java. 47 chiefs were tortured and executed. Okay, so this was happening in the new countries that they were finding in the New World. But with the Mughal Empire, the English or the French could never entertain this, because they were very, very powerful. The great Mughals, they had 4 million men under arms. So the idea of invading them was never a reality as well. So they maintained, the British or the English used diplomacy to sort of work their way with the Mughal emperor himself. And this is how things really began. And then King James sent an envoy. He sent an ambassador called Sir Thomas Roe. He's really important, actually. Sir Thomas Roe is an important figure in this period of the history. He arrived in Ajmer in 1615, and he brought some gifts to the emperor at the time. It's very, very fascinating, and I'll share in the comment section after this video an image which really captures what the Emperor Jahangir was really interested in. This is at the zenith. This is at the height of Mughal rule. And I'll quote this from the book. He says, Jahangir was, after all, an enormously sensitive, curious, and intelligent man, observant of the world around him, and a keen collector of curiosities. from Venetian swords and globes to Safavid silks, jade pebbles, and even novel teeth. A proud inheritor of the Indo-Mughal tradition of aesthetics and knowledge, as well as maintaining the empire and commissioning great works of art, he took an active interest in goat and cheetah breeding, medicine, astronomy, and had an insatiable appetite for animal husbandry, like some Enlightenment landowner of later generations. So he wasn't, when they came to see him, when Thomas Roe came to see him, Jahangir wasn't really interested in English. He didn't really see any value in them. He didn't see any value in what they could bring to the empire. So this is, the tides have turned, right? They were, when you're a superpower, everybody has to come to you. And so, there's a piece of art that captures this, which I will share, like I mentioned, in the group, on the comment section later on as well. They were curious about the English, to be honest, and Dalrymple mentions this in his book, but they weren't really overwhelmed. They weren't really, really interested in what the English had to offer. And in fact, Sir Thomas Roe himself says that I was frustrated by the way they considered the English as low priority. They weren't that significant. They weren't that important to us. Okay. And there's a very famous artwork, which I'm going to share in the comment section afterwards, which basically captures it all. And when you look at the image, what you will see is you'll see a sheikh, a man with a white beard. Mine is still black, not white quite yet. My thobe is white. My garment is white. My beard is not white just yet. But you'll see in the image the picture of Jahangir, who prefers Sufi shaykhs to kings, right? And he'd rather spend time learning knowledge. He'd rather spend time being enlightened. And you'll see that in the image that I'm going to share in the group or on the comment section later on. Very, 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 very much captures what Jahangir was all about. And he was not interested in all of this wealth. He was more interested in sophisticated forms of knowledge. Okay. And so the Brits were kept waiting. The English, I keep saying the Brits, I mean English. The English were kept waiting, and they weren't very much interested in. And it took a long, long time. But the English were learning over 200 years what would entice, what would interest the Mughal emperors. Okay. However, even though they weren't big market players in terms of other European countries, their profits were gradually increasing. The balance sheet was showing healthy, the profits were coming through. So it was still showing that they were making some sort of profit on their venture. And if you're a company, you have to keep your shareholders happy, right? And this is what the East India Company was all about. It was a company that had to make profits, had to show profits at whatever cost, right? Whatever needed to be done, at whatever cost, profits needed to be shown as well. It was not until 1626 that a company founded its first fortified Indian base in a place called Armagan in Norfolk, Pulicat. This didn't last very long, and then they built another one in Madras. This one flourished. So the second one flourished, and it became the first English colonial town in India, and it had its own private civil administration center. Later on, they built another one, which was in Mumbai. At the time, it wasn't spelled the way it's spelled today, with the B, Mumbai or Bombay. It was spelled Bumbye. And so this was the second one that they built as well. This was in around 1665 as well. Now, when the British were in Bombay, and I don't want to go into this, when you read the book, I just note the page. There's an interesting anecdote on page 22, 23 in the book about how it eclipsed Surat in terms of its business, and how the local residents weren't happy with the behavior of the English. This is something that we are sometimes familiar with when we go abroad. So we know about this as well. In any case, the company used its strength against the Mughals only once. So at this time, they did try their luck. With the Mughals, but it ended in fantastic failure. So they did try to cause some damage to the Mughal empire, even at this early stage, even though it was a small company, and they did try to test the waters with the Mughal empire. The person in question was someone called Sir Josiah child, and he basically tried his luck with them. A fleet in 1686 sailed from London to Bengal with 19 warships, 200 cannons, and 600 soldiers. He says himself, "Become us to seize what we can and draw the English sword. We're coming there to take India from them." But the Mughal Empire, the Mughal war machine, swept away the English army like flies, as the author says in the book as well. And they were completely expelled from Bengal. And the factory that was there in Surat was also shut down because the Mughal Empire, the emperor, has given them a license to operate there, but he felt that they'd violated that. They were now thinking about conquest. So the factory was shut down. However, Aurangzeb, being the person that he was, did feel sorry for them, and he forgave them in 1690 as well. So he did forgive them for this minor attempt, if you like, at trying their luck at the Mughal Empire. In Bengal, they founded a new base in Bengal, and it had a lot of potential. And we'll see this in the future lectures, how Bengal became a very profitable place for the English, for the company itself. And they say that it was the finest as the most fruitful country in the world as well. Okay. And so it was a very wealthy region of the Mughal Empire as well. The next stage, the next person that's interesting in this is Aurangzeb. Aurangzeb was the one who, on his death, things really changed in India. And Aurangzeb was, in many ways, seen as an Islamic Puritan. He was very intolerant and he was very dogmatic. And so we know that when Muslim leaders are very aggressive, very puritanical, this actually has a problem. It creates resentment, right? When people are harsh, it creates resentment. He was generally very harsh, repressive, and unpopular. He wasn't loved by the people. And he forced the ulama, he allowed the ulama to impose stricter Sharia law. The Mughal Empire, if you read, and we'll cover this in other books, was a very tolerant, open, cosmopolitan society. I mean, we had all sorts of people living under Mughal rule as well. He, for example, in 1679, reimposed the jizya tax on all non-Muslims, which had previously been abolished by Akbar. So he was quite aggressive. He also tore the country up. There was a lot of infighting, because the empire really was built on pragmatic tolerance and alliance with the Hindus, especially with the Rajputs, who were really the core of the Mughal war machine. So they were Hindus, but they were really people who fought for the empire. Okay, but he was fighting with people, and because of this, he was exhausting, overstretching the empire. Right, war is not cheap, and it costs a lot of money to engage in war. Especially with the Maratha Hindus, they were particularly upset, and they proved to be his nemesis. They were the ones who really made life, because he went after them and made life difficult for them. They went after him. They were very well trained in terms of battling, and so they turned out to be Aurangzeb's nemesis as well. And so they began to really take over and weaken the Mughal Empire as well. Banditry, for example, became endemic. Revolt was taking place. Resistance was significant now. Things were becoming really, really expensive now. And so really Aurangzeb was really too aggressive, according to our author here in the book. And so Aurangzeb, in fact, on his deathbed, reflects upon this, and he writes a very sad and defeated letter to his son Azam. Okay, and he died in 1707 on the 20th of February. So really, he was, what some people would say, he was the one. With his death, the empire really began to crack and crumble. Okay, at some other point in the future, I will do a book. I will do a session where we look at how powerful the empire actually was. It was a really powerful empire. Amazing, but that's not what we want to do in this book. And the authority of the Mughal Empire was dissolving after his death. A number of emperors came. For example, in the worst year of all, in 1719, 4 different emperors occupied what was the Peacock Throne. Right? So things were just changing. Leadership was changing rapidly as well. His descendants were just fighting amongst themselves, and this is something that we know, right? If you see the end of a civilization and empire, you'll see that they start fighting amongst themselves, whether it's in Muslim empires or even in non-Muslim states or empires. When people start fighting amongst themselves, fighting for power, this is a sign that you're sick. This is a sign that your empire is beginning to crumble as well. And the Marathas, which we talked about before, they were controlling much of central and western India. So they had gained a lot of control. A lot of self-rule was happening away from the Mughal empire. So there was less centralized control of the empire. For example, you had Nizamul Mulk, Nawab Sadat Khan, 2 people, Sadat Khan, who'd go on actually themselves to found their own dynasties. Okay, and they also themselves dominated large areas of India for hundreds of years. So it was all fragmented in India. Bengal was also an exception to this, where the governor, a former Brahmin slave who'd converted to Islam, Murshid Quli Khan, he remained faithful to the emperor. So there were people who remained faithful. However, the country generally was becoming very, very anarchic. There was anarchy, and this is why, The Anarchy is the book title, right? There was anarchy after the death, really after Aurangzeb as well. And so the East India Company began to realize now that they may be able to enforce its way in a way that they wouldn't have been able to even dream of when they first came to India. Okay. And so 9 years later, the East India Company, for example, they engage in some sort of warfare with some of the Mughal soldiers, and this was the first act of major violence by an Englishman against the ordinary people of India. So they did a place called Fort St. David, which is a little south of Madras. Madras is, if you look on a map, is at the south of India. This is where the English really started to sort of build their little encampments, where the French were also around there as well. So the French were already established there, and the English were there. As you can imagine, they're both hungry wolves, if you like, and they're waiting to seize upon the empire. Something also was happening. So there was the Mughal Empire was cracking; it was falling apart. But something happened in Delhi, which was very, very significant. And this is when I talked about a lion coming in. In 1737, Delhi had about 2 million inhabitants. It was bigger than London and Paris combined. This is how big the population of the place was. There was a emperor at the time called Muhammad Shah. He was also called Rangila, or Colorful, or the Merrymaker was his name. And so there was a lot of regional rule. He was there, but he wasn't really effective as an emperor as well. There was the Maratha armies, which we talked about before. They were at the gates of Delhi as well, and they were literally at the shadow of the Qutb Minar, which is the famous tower in Delhi, and they were ready to take India from the Muslim emperors, right, which had been under Islamic rule for almost 600 years. But there was a greater threat. There was a much more greater threat, which I want to talk about for the last part of this lecture, is someone called Nadir Shah Afshar. He was born in Persian Khorasan, and he began to rapidly make his way up. This is in the past Afghanistan in the north. This was in the Safavid Empire, the Safavid Persian army. He'd made his way up the ranks, and Nadir Shah Afshar was a very important person, again, in the history of the decline of the Mughal Empire. So there was decline already taking place, and he sees, for example, in 1732, he seized the throne of the Persian Empire at the time, in a military coup as well. And now he set eyes on Delhi. Delhi for him was the gold, golden calf was a prize that he really wanted to pursue. So on 21st of May, he, with a force of 80,000 fighting men, he crossed into the Mughal Empire. This is the first real invasion into the Mughal Empire. And he headed for the summer capital of Kabul. And this was the first time that India was invaded for almost 2 centuries. And there was also a lot of infighting between the Mughal generals themselves. So, for example, the 2 people I talked about before, Saadat Khan and Nizamul Mulk, they were generals in the Mughal Empire, but they were fighting among themselves anyway. So his job, Nadir Shah's job, was made a lot more easier because of this. He managed to capture the emperor himself. He used a trick basically to get hold of the emperor, and they entered the Mughal capital on the 29th of March. Okay, and there was a bloody massacre of Delhi. He said, one of the writers describes the massacre as the Iranians have behaved like animals. At least 100,000 people were killed, and Nader Shah gave orders to kill anyone who defended himself. As a result, it seemed if it were raining blood, for the drains were streaming with it. Okay, so he took everything. 340 years, accumulated wealth of 340 years, changed hands from the Mughal Empire to Nadir Shah in a matter of moments. He took everything, but he never had any intention to rule India. He just took all the wealth and went back. He had no intention of establishing an empire in India. He just wanted to plunder it, right? Because he was more interested in fighting his other enemies, and he needed money to fund his war with the Ottomans and the Russians. So he was more interested in fighting the Ottomans and Russians, and he just took all the wealth and went back up north as well. He took the Jahangir's magnificent peacock throne, which had a Kohinoor diamond and a great Timur ruby as well. He also took the great Mughal diamond, which was reputedly to be the largest in the world. And so he took all of this, he took all of it back with him, and just plundered Delhi and left the Mughal Empire with nothing, basically. And so people began to realize that the Mughal Empire is really truly finished now. And there was anarchy, because obviously if you don't have a state, if you don't have a powerful structure, authority, then you're vulnerable. And so this is what happened with Nadir Shah as well. So the Europeans began to dream, the English began to dream of conquests in India, and Nadir Shah had really made it easy for them. Can you see? So this is really, really important to bear in mind. There was also infighting between the French were already there in a place called Pondicherry, which is at the south of India. There was infighting between them. They really had a lot of control of South India, and I'm not going to go into that. You can read that in the book itself. The British were just eyeing this. The British were competing with the French. The British were just observing what the French were doing and just waiting for the opportunity to really seize upon India. So these, they were like wolves. As Nadir Shah's come in, he's basically mauled the animal. He's taken what he wants, and now the vultures are ready to pounce upon what is left and to make the most of what is India. Okay, so there was this Anglo-French rivalry. The French and the English, they were very much rivals. In the next chapter, in the next lecture, we'll talk about this, how this really picked up. And that's enough for chapter 1 of this book. Number 2, the next chapter, an offer he could not refuse. We'll do that in the next video. I hope you find it useful. That's a good summary of the first chapter of the book. I will send a link in the comment section of an image where we are shown Jahangir, who prefers the companionship of Sufi shaykhs to kings rather than talking to the English. So that's an interesting image to look at, worth reflecting upon as well. Until then, I'll see you soon. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.